Jack's weathered hands trembled as he hung a one sign on Ghost, the wild Mustang that had saved him after the nightmares of Afghanistan faded. The desperate veteran never expected the auction would end with a twist that would stun everyone in their small ranching town. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust kicked up around Jack Wilson's worn boots as he made his way across the paddock, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the ranch. At 65, Jack's weathered face told the story of a man who had seen more than his fair share of hardship. The lines etched around his eyes had deepened over the years, first from squinting under the desert sun in Afghanistan, and later from working the land he'd purchased upon his return home. His military service cap, faded and frayed at the edges, remained a permanent fixture on his head, a silent reminder of the life he'd lived before settling in the small town of Redstone. In the far corner of the corral stood Ghost, a magnificent white Mustang with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the mountains he'd come from. The horse's muscles rippled beneath his coat as he trotted toward Jack, nickering softly in greeting. Unlike the other horses on neighboring ranches, Ghost had come to Jack wild and untamed, captured during a Bureau of Land Management roundup 3 years ago. "Morning, old friend," Jack murmured, reaching out to stroke the horse's muzzle. Ghost pushed his head against Jack's palm, a gesture of affection that had taken months to earn. Jack smiled, remembering the day he'd first laid eyes on the Mustang, wild-eyed and defiant in the holding pen, striking out at anyone who dared come close. "They said you were untrainable," Jack said quietly, running his hand along Ghost's neck. "Guess we proved them wrong, didn't we?" The bond between the veteran and the wild horse had been forged through patience and mutual respect. Where others had seen a dangerous animal, Jack had recognized something familiar, the wariness of a creature that had seen too much, the reluctance to trust. It was the same look he'd seen in his own eyes after returning from his third tour. Jack reached into his pocket for the apple he'd brought, offering it on his flattened palm. Ghost's lips tickled his skin as the horse delicately took the treat. These small moments of connection had become the cornerstone of Jack's existence, a routine that anchored him when the nightmares came or when the silence of his empty house grew too loud. "Mr. Wilson, you out here?" The voice broke through the morning quiet, shattering the peaceful moment. Jack turned to see Thomas Green, the bank manager, making his way across the yard. His pressed shirt and polished shoes looked out of place against the dusty backdrop of the ranch. Jack's stomach knotted. He'd been expecting this visit, though he'd hoped to have more time. "Morning, Thomas," Jack called, his voice carefully neutral. "Bit early for a social call." The banker shifted uncomfortably, clutching a leather portfolio. "I wish it were social, Jack. You know why I'm here." Jack nodded, giving Ghost one final pat before stepping away from the corral to meet Thomas. The drought that had gripped the region for the past 18 months had hit everyone hard. Hay prices had tripled. The small savings Jack had managed to put aside had dwindled to nothing, and the mortgage payments on his ranch had fallen further behind with each passing month. "I've got until the end of the month," Jack said, his voice low. That was the agreement. Thomas's expression softened with genuine regret. "The bank's board met yesterday. They've decided to accelerate the foreclosure. I tried to fight for you, Jack, but with the market the way it is..." He trailed off, extending the folder. "I'm sorry. You have until Friday to either bring the account current or vacate the property." Friday. 3 days. Jack took the papers wordlessly, the weight of them seeming to pull his shoulders down further. "What about my horses?" Jack asked, thinking of the 6 rescue horses he'd taken in over the years, abandoned or neglected animals that had found sanctuary on his small ranch. "There's a provision for the livestock," Thomas said. "The bank will arrange for them to go to auction. You'll receive any proceeds after the debt is settled, of course." Jack's jaw tightened. The debt settlement would swallow any money from the sale. Horses weren't worth much these days, especially older rescues. His gaze drifted back to Ghost. The Mustang was watching them intently, as if understanding the gravity of the conversation. "I appreciate you bringing this yourself, Thomas," Jack said finally, tucking the folder under his arm. 40 years in the military had taught him to face bad news with dignity. After the banker left, Jack returned to Ghost's side. The horse nudged his shoulder gently. "Looks like we're in trouble, boy," Jack whispered. "I don't know how to fix this one." That night, sitting at his kitchen table with papers spread before him, Jack confronted the harsh reality of his situation. The numbers didn't lie. He was out of options. His military pension barely covered the basics, and the small farrier business he ran had suffered along with everyone else during the drought. He'd already sold his truck, his late wife's jewelry, anything of value he had left, except the horses. The thought of sending his rescues to auction made his chest tighten. He knew the likely outcome for older horses in this market, the slaughterhouses across the border. They deserved better than that. They deserved care and dignity in their later years, just as any veteran would. Jack rubbed his tired eyes and made a decision. He would call around in the morning, reach out to everyone he knew who might be able to take in a horse. He'd find homes for them, even if it meant giving them away. Better that than the alternative. But Ghost was different. The Mustang was young and strong, with years ahead of him. He was also special, one of the few Keeger Mustangs to come out of the mountains, with bloodlines tracing back to the original Spanish horses. To the right buyer, Ghost would be valuable. The realization settled heavily in Jack's chest. Selling Ghost might generate enough money to at least secure a small rental somewhere, to start over. It would mean separating from the animal that had become his closest companion, but what choice did he have? Jack pushed himself up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the moon cast silver light across the paddock where his horses dozed. 3 days. He had 3 days to say goodbye to everything he'd built, to the peace he'd finally found after years of carrying the war inside him. He thought of Ghost, how the horse had come to him wild and untrusting, how they had healed each other. The Mustang deserved a good home, someone who would understand his spirit. Jack would make sure of that, even if it broke his heart to let him go. With a heavy sigh, Jack picked up his phone. There was only one call to make tonight, to his old friend Mike Leary, who ran the local livestock auction. Come Friday, Jack would need to be ready, and Ghost would need to find a new home. Dawn broke over Redstone with a brilliance that seemed to mock Jack's somber mood. He'd slept poorly, his dreams filled with fragments of his past, the thundering explosions from his combat days seamlessly blending with the imagined sound of the auctioneer's gavel. By the time the first light filtered through his curtains, Jack had already been up for hours, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The phone call to Mike Leary the previous night had been difficult. Mike, a gruff man with a surprisingly gentle touch when it came to animals, had listened quietly as Jack explained his situation. "I'll help any way I can, Jack," Mike had said, his voice crackling over the poor connection. "But you know what the market's like right now. Drought's got everyone selling and nobody buying." Jack had expected as much. "I've got one that might fetch a decent price. That Kiger Mustang I've been working with." The silence on the other end had stretched for several seconds. Mike knew Ghost's story, had seen the remarkable transformation of the once wild horse under Jack's patient guidance. "You sure about that? Thought that horse was special to you." "He is," Jack had replied, his voice tight, "but I'm out of options." After finishing his coffee, Jack pulled on his boots and headed out to start his morning chores. The routine was comforting, filling water troughs, distributing hay, checking each horse for any signs of trouble. His rescues greeted him with familiar whinnies and nudges, unaware that their peaceful existence was about to be upended. When he reached Ghost's paddock, the Mustang was standing alert, ears pricked forward, watching Jack approach. Even after 3 years, there remained something untamed about Ghost, not dangerous but proud, as if part of him would always belong to the mountains where he was born. "Today's the day, boy," Jack said quietly, opening the gate. "Mike's coming by to take a look at you." As if understanding, Ghost tossed his head and snorted, backing away a few steps before approaching again. Jack had never used a halter with Ghost. Their relationship had evolved beyond the need for such tools. A soft word, a gesture, and the Mustang would follow willingly, a partnership built on trust rather than dominance. By mid-morning, the sound of tires on gravel announced Mike's arrival. Jack watched as his friend's truck pulled up beside the barn, dust settling around it in the still air. Mike stepped out, his weathered cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. "Jack," he nodded in greeting, shaking the veteran's hand firmly. "Appreciate you coming out, Mike." The two men walked in silence toward the paddock where Ghost was grazing. As they approached, the horse lifted his head, eyes fixed on the stranger beside Jack. "He's filled out nice," Mike observed, leaning against the fence. "Good conformation. How's he been under saddle? Responsive, quick learner." "Quick. Still has his wild instincts, but he'll listen if you ask right." Jack clicked his tongue softly, and Ghost approached, keeping a curious eye on Mike. Mike studied the Mustang with an appraiser's gaze. "He's worth something, no doubt. Kiger bloodlines, good size, sound. But Jack..." He turned to look at his friend. "The market's flooded. Even a horse like this. I can't promise much." Jack nodded, having expected this. "What do you think?" Mike removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "If we're lucky, maybe 1,500, possibly 2,000 to the right buyer, but that's optimistic in this economy." The amount was less than Jack had hoped for, but more than he'd feared. Enough, perhaps, to secure a small place to rent for a few months while he figured out his next steps. "List him for Friday, then," Jack said, the decision heavy in his chest. Mike replaced his hat, squinting at Jack. "You know, you could set a reserve price. If he doesn't fetch what you need, you could always try private sale." Jack considered this. "What would you suggest?" "Start high. Worst case, we drop it if there's no interest." Mike paused. "Though I've been thinking, what if we try something different, might draw more attention?" "I'm listening." "Set the opening bid at $1. Jack stared at his friend. $1? That's crazy, Mike." Mike shook his head. "Not as crazy as it sounds. It'll get people talking, create some buzz. Nothing drives up bidding like a crowd that thinks they're getting a steal. And with a horse like this, trust me, it won't stay at $1 for more than 5 seconds." Jack wasn't convinced. "Seems risky." "More risky than setting a high reserve nobody meets?" Mike countered. "Look, I've been doing this 30 years. Sometimes you gotta think outside the box. Plus, a story like yours, veteran losing his ranch, special bond with a wild Mustang, that's the kind of thing people connect with. We play this right, you might do better than you think." Jack looked back at Ghost, who had returned to grazing, seemingly unconcerned with the conversation that would determine his fate. The idea of essentially giving the horse away, even as a marketing tactic, felt wrong. Yet there was a certain logic to Mike's suggestion. "Let me think about it," Jack said finally. After Mike left, Jack spent the afternoon making calls to everyone he knew who might take one of his rescue horses. By sunset, he had tentative homes for 4 of them. Not ideal situations, but places where they would be cared for at least. The oldest mare, a 25-year-old quarter horse named Penny, was proving the hardest to place. No one wanted to take on a horse in her twilight years. As darkness fell, Jack sat on the porch steps, watching his small herd graze in the pasture. Ghost stood slightly apart from the others, as he often did, his white coat gleaming silver in the moonlight. The thought of sending him to auction still felt like a betrayal, but what choice did he have? Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message from Mike. Thought more about our conversation. Trust me on this one. $1 opening, no reserve. I've got a feeling. Jack stared at the message for a long time. The idea still seemed absurd, but Mike knew the market, knew the people who frequented these auctions, and Jack was out of better ideas. With a deep breath, he typed back, "Okay, let's do it. $1 starting bid." He hit send before he could change his mind, then looked back at Ghost. $1 for a horse that had saved him in ways no human could understand. The absurdity of it made his throat tight. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered into the night. "I'll make sure you go to someone good. That's a promise." News traveled fast in a town like Redstone. By Wednesday afternoon, word of Jack Wilson's unusual auction listing had spread from the feed store to the diner, from the gas station to the post office. The dollar horse, they called it. The veteran's Mustang going for pocket change. Sarah Chen, who owned the local newspaper, caught wind of the story while having lunch at Maggie's diner. Intrigued, she jotted notes on a napkin as Maggie filled her in on the details. "Jack Wilson, the quiet vet who lives out on River Road?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee. Maggie nodded, leaning across the counter. "Same one. Bank's foreclosing on Friday. He's selling everything, including that white Mustang of his. Mike over at the auction house says they're starting the bidding at $1. Can you believe it?" Sarah couldn't, in fact. She'd met Jack a few times, interviewed him once for a Veterans Day piece. Reserved man, spoke little about his service, but had been forthcoming about his work with rescue horses. The white Mustang had featured prominently in that conversation, a wild Kiger that Jack had gentled through patience alone. "Think I'll drive out there," Sarah decided, leaving money for her lunch. "Sounds like there might be a story worth telling." Back at the ranch, Jack was grooming Ghost, each stroke of the brush a familiar motion that soothed them both. He'd washed the Mustang that morning, the white coat now gleaming in the afternoon sun. If Ghost was going to auction, Jack was determined he would look his best. "You're going to turn heads on Friday, that's for sure," Jack murmured, working a small tangle from Ghost's mane. The horse stood patiently, occasionally turning to nudge Jack's shoulder, a gesture that never failed to bring a smile to the veteran's face. The sound of tires on gravel drew Jack's attention. A small blue car he didn't recognize was coming up the drive. He gave Ghost a final pat and stepped out of the paddock to greet the visitor. Sarah Chen stepped from her car, notepad already in hand. "Mr. Wilson?" "Sarah Chen from the Redstone Gazette. Got a minute to talk?" Jack's expression tightened. "Ms. Chen, this about the auction?" "Word travels fast around here," she acknowledged. "I heard you're starting the bidding for your Mustang at $1. Thought there might be a story people would want to hear." Jack hesitated. He wasn't one for attention, had spent most of his post-military life seeking quiet and solitude, but Mike's words came back to him. A story like his might connect with people, might ensure Ghost found a good home. "I suppose I could spare a few minutes," he conceded. They sat on the porch, the worn wooden steps creaking beneath them. As Jack spoke about Ghost, finding him wild-eyed and fearful at the BLM adoption, the month spent just sitting quietly near the corral, the first moment the Mustang had approached him voluntarily, Sarah's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. "And now you have to sell him," Sarah prompted when Jack fell silent. Jack's weathered hands clasped together. "Don't have a choice. Bank's taking everything on Friday. The dollar bid. That was Mike's idea. Said it might attract more buyers." "What happens to you after the auction?" Sarah asked. The question caught Jack off guard. He'd been so focused on finding homes for his horses that he'd barely considered his own future. "Haven't figured that part out yet," he admitted. "Got my pension. Might rent a room in town until I can get back on my feet." Sarah made a few more notes, then asked if she could take some photos of Ghost. Jack agreed, and they walked to the paddock together. The Mustang approached curiously, allowing Sarah to capture several shots that showcased his striking appearance. "This will run in tomorrow's paper," Sarah said as she prepared to leave. "Is there anything specific you want people to know?" Jack thought for a moment. "Just that he deserves a good home. Someone who'll understand him. He's not like other horses. He's got a wild heart still, needs someone who'll respect that." Sarah nodded. "I'll make sure that comes through." After she left, Jack returned to his chores, trying not to dwell on the article or what it might bring. One more day until the auction. One more day with Ghost. Thursday's edition of the Redstone Gazette featured Ghost's photo on the front page. Sarah had titled the piece, "Veteran's Last Stand, the Dollar Horse Auction," and had woven Jack's military service, his work with rescue horses, and the impending foreclosure into a story that captured the essence of what was being lost. By noon, Jack had received 7 phone calls from strangers expressing interest in Ghost. Some seemed genuinely concerned about his situation, offering help he politely declined. Others were clearly speculators hoping for a bargain. Jack took down names and directed them all to the auction, his heart growing heavier with each call. In town, the article sparked conversations in every corner. At the VFW Hall, several veterans gathered to discuss what could be done for one of their own. At the town council meeting that evening, Mayor Davis brought up Jack's situation, wondering aloud if there were community resources that might help. "We can't just let him lose everything," said Eleanor Watson, who had taught at the local school for 40 years. "That man served our country, and from what I hear, he saved more than a few horses that nobody else wanted." Across town, in the sprawling estate just outside Redstone's limits, Diane Mercer read the article with interest. As the widow of a wealthy rancher and a passionate horse enthusiast, she had both the means and the knowledge to appreciate what Jack was going through. The photo of Ghost caught her attention. Proud stance, intelligent eyes, the distinctive markings of Keeger Mustang lineage. "James," she called to her ranch manager, "we're going to an auction tomorrow." Friday morning arrived with the soft glow of dawn spreading across the landscape. Jack had been awake for hours, sitting on his porch watching the light change over the land he would soon leave behind. The paperwork for the foreclosure lay signed on his kitchen table, a surrender made official. In the paddock, Ghost and the remaining rescue horses grazed peacefully. The trailers would arrive soon, Mike coming for Ghost and various friends and neighbors to collect the rescues Jack had managed to place. Jack sipped his coffee, memorizing every detail of the scene before him. The way the sunlight caught the weathered red of the barn, the pattern of shadows cast by the old oak tree, the sound of hooves on soft earth. 30 years in the military had taught him how to say goodbye to places, but this one cut deeper than most. The distant rumble of an approaching vehicle signaled that it was time. Jack stood, straightening his back against the ache that never quite left him these days. He would face this day like he had faced every difficult day in his life, with quiet dignity and resolve. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked forward at the sound of the approaching trailer. The Mustang's eyes met Jack's across the distance, a connection that spoke volumes in its silence. "It's time, boy," Jack whispered. "Time to find you a new home." Mike's trailer pulled up to the ranch precisely at 8. The auction was scheduled for noon, but they needed time to transport Ghost and get him settled before the bidding began. Jack stood waiting, Ghost's lead rope in hand, though he rarely needed it. The Mustang had already been brushed until his white coat gleamed, his mane and tail flowing like silver streams in the morning light. "Ready?" Mike asked, stepping out of his truck. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. Together they opened the trailer and Jack led Ghost toward it. The Mustang hesitated at the ramp, nostrils flaring as he scented the unfamiliar space. This would be only the second time in his life that Ghost had entered a trailer, the first being when he was transported from the BLM holding pens to Jack's ranch 3 years ago. "It's all right, boy," Jack murmured, his hand steady on Ghost's neck. Just one more journey. After a moment's consideration, Ghost stepped forward, following Jack into the trailer. Jack secured him loosely, making sure he would be comfortable for the short drive to town, then stepped back out. The space between them seemed to stretch like a physical thing, the beginning of a separation Jack had never wanted. "I'll see you there," he told Mike, his voice gruff. He needed to follow in his own truck, needed these last moments to collect himself, before facing the crowd he knew would be waiting. The drive into Redstone passed in a blur of familiar landscapes that Jack barely saw. His mind was filled with memories of Ghost. The first time the Mustang had approached him voluntarily, the morning Ghost had followed him around the ranch without a lead, the way the horse would rest his head on Jack's shoulder during quiet evenings. Small moments that had healed something broken inside the veteran, something the war had shattered and civilian life had failed to mend. The auction yard was already bustling when Jack arrived. Mike's weekly livestock sales usually drew a decent crowd, but today the parking lot was full to overflowing, vehicles lining the road leading to the facility. Jack's stomach tightened. Sarah's article had certainly drawn attention. He parked his truck and made his way toward the pens behind the auction hall where the livestock was held before sale. Ghost had been given a separate enclosure, and Jack could see a small crowd gathered around it, people pointing and discussing the white Mustang that had made the front page. Ghost spotted Jack immediately, ears pricking forward as he moved to the fence. The other onlookers stepped back as Jack approached, a quiet respect in their stance as they recognized the veteran from the newspaper photo. "Quite a turnout," Mike said, appearing at Jack's side. "Sarah's article did the trick. I've had calls from 3 counties over about this horse." Jack nodded, reaching through the bars to stroke Ghost's nose. "Just hope he goes to the right person." "I put him last in the lineup," Mike added. "Give everyone a chance to get here. More bidders means better price." The hours until the auction dragged and flew simultaneously. Jack stayed near Ghost for most of that time, only stepping away when prospective buyers came to look more closely at the Mustang. He watched their faces, trying to gauge their intentions. The calculating look of the traders seeking a quick profit, the appreciative eye of genuine horsemen who recognized Ghost's quality, the occasional soft gaze of someone who simply loved animals. At 11:30, Mike found Jack again. "We're starting in 30. You should come get a seat. It's packed in there." Jack followed Mike into the auction hall, unprepared for the scene that greeted him. Every seat was taken, with people standing along the walls and at the back of the room. The low buzz of conversation filled the space, anticipation hanging in the air like static before a storm. "Jack, over here!" Jack turned to see Bill Matthews, his nearest neighbor, waving from the front row. Beside him was an empty seat that Bill was clearly saving. Jack made his way over, nodding thanks as he sat down. "Didn't expect this kind of turnout," Jack remarked, surveying the crowd. Bill's weathered face creased in a smile. "Word gets around. Lots of folks here pulling for you, Jack." Before Jack could respond, the auctioneer took his position and the sale began. Jack sat through the auction of cattle, sheep, and several other horses, barely registering the proceedings. His mind was focused on what was to come, on the moment he would watch Ghost pass into someone else's hands. Finally, after what seemed like both an eternity and no time at all, Mike appeared leading Ghost into the sale ring. The Mustang's white coat stood out starkly against the dark wood of the enclosure, his head high as he surveyed the crowded room. A ripple of appreciation moved through the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, "next up is Lot 47, a 5-year-old Kiger Mustang gelding. This is the horse you've been reading about, folks, the dollar horse, captured from the wild 3 years ago and gentled by our own local veteran, Jack Wilson." He nodded toward Jack, and many heads turned in his direction. "As advertised, we're starting the bidding at $1. Who'll give me $1 for this fine animal?" Several hands shot up immediately. Jack's heart thumped painfully in his chest. "I have $1, now 2, now 5, the auctioneer called, his practice patter picking up speed as the bidding quickly escalated. $10, now 20, now 50. The price jumped rapidly, $100, $200, $500. Ghost stood calmly in the ring, occasionally turning to look at Jack, seeming almost puzzled by the commotion around him. $800, now 9, now $1,000, the auctioneer continued. Some bidders were dropping out now as the price climbed, but there were still several hands going up around the room. $1,200, now $1,500. Jack watched with mixed emotions. The price had already exceeded what Mike had suggested was possible in the current market. Each increase meant more security for Jack's uncertain future, but also reinforced the reality that Ghost was leaving. $2,000, called a voice from the back. Jack turned to see a well-dressed woman in her 60s standing near the entrance. There was something familiar about her, though Jack couldn't place her. "I have 2,000. Do I hear 2,500? The auctioneer prompted. Another hand went up, a man in a cowboy hat near the side wall. 2,500 to the gentleman in the hat. Do I hear 3,000? The well-dressed woman raised her hand again. 3,000. The bidding continued to climb, now primarily between the woman at the back and the man in the hat. 4,000. 5,000. The room had gone quiet except for the auctioneer's voice and the occasional gasp as the price kept rising well beyond what anyone had expected. $6,000, the woman called, her voice clear and determined. The man in the hat hesitated, then slowly shook his head, backing out of the bidding. $6,000, the auctioneer repeated, going once, going twice. The crack of the gavel echoed through the suddenly silent room. Sold for $6,000 to the lady at the back. Jack sat stunned. $6,000, far more than he had ever imagined Ghost might bring. It would be enough to start over, enough to give him breathing room to figure out his next steps. Yet as he watched Ghost being led from the ring, the victory felt hollow. The auction room emptied gradually, people filtering out in 2s and 3s, many pausing to shake Jack's hand or clap him on the shoulder. Their words of congratulation felt distant, as if reaching him through water. $6,000, a small fortune in their struggling community, enough to give him a fresh start. Yet all Jack could think about was Ghost, being loaded into a stranger's trailer heading to an unknown future. "You coming, Jack?" Bill asked, standing from his seat beside him. "Most folks are heading over to Maggie's to celebrate." Jack shook his head. "Think I'll stick around. Should probably meet whoever bought him." Bill nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Let me know if you need anything. Offer still stands if you want to stay at my place until you figure things out." After Bill left, Jack remained seated in the nearly empty auction hall. Mike approached, a white envelope in his hand. "Quite a day," Mike said, sitting beside his friend. 6,000. Never would have predicted that. Jack took the envelope Mike offered. Who was she? The woman who bought him? Diane Mercer, widow of Robert Mercer, had that big ranch on the north side of the county. Mike paused. "She's waiting to meet you, if you're up for it. Said she wanted to talk to you about Ghost." Jack's pulse quickened. "Where is she?" "By the loading area. I told her you might want a word." Jack found her standing near the pens, watching as Ghost was prepared for transport. She cut an elegant figure, tailored clothes, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, spine straight despite her years. As Jack approached, she turned, her gaze direct and assessing. "Mr. Wilson," she said, extending her hand. "Diane Mercer, I believe I just purchased your horse." Jack shook her hand, feeling calluses that spoke of a lifetime with horses, despite her refined appearance. "Ma'am, you paid a generous price." She smiled slightly. "I paid what he's worth. Quality horseflesh is hard to come by, especially with Kiger bloodlines." Jack glanced past her to where Ghost stood calmly as the handlers prepared him for the trailer. The Mustang's eyes kept drifting toward Jack as if wondering why they were still here, why they weren't heading home together. "Ms. Mercer," Jack began, his voice low. "I don't mean to be forward, but I need to know what your plans are for him. Ghost isn't just any horse, he's special." Diane studied Jack's face, seeming to consider her response carefully. "I read about you in the paper, Mr. Wilson. About how you gentled that Mustang when others couldn't. About your work with rescue horses. About the foreclosure." She paused. "I'm curious. If circumstances were different, would you have sold him?" The question caught Jack off guard. "No, ma'am. Not for any price." She nodded, as if he had confirmed something she already suspected. "I thought as much. I'm not in the habit of separating a man from his horse, Mr. Wilson, but I am in the habit of recognizing quality when I see it, both in horses and in horsemanship." Jack waited, unsure where she was going with this. "I own Silvercrest Ranch," she continued. 2,000 acres, about 40 miles north of here. We specialize in breeding and training performance horses, though I've developed an interest in Mustang conservation in recent years." She gestured toward Ghost. "A horse like that, with his intelligence and bloodlines, could make a valuable addition to our program." Jack's heart sank further with each word. Ghost would become a breeding stud, valuable for his genetics rather than his spirit, his unique personality. "But," Diane added, noticing Jack's expression, "that's not why I bought him today." Before Jack could ask what she meant, one of the handlers approached. "Ma'am, we're ready to load whenever you are." Diane nodded. "Thank you, James, but there's been a slight change of plans." She turned back to Jack. "Mr. Wilson, would you mind helping load Ghost? He seems a bit unsettled with strangers handling him." Jack didn't hesitate. He moved toward Ghost, who immediately perked up, nickering softly in recognition. The Mustang lowered his head, allowing Jack to stroke his face, leaning into the touch as if to say, "There you are. What took you so long?" "Hey, boy," Jack murmured, the familiar words catching in his throat. "Time to go with Ms. Mercer now." With gentle guidance, Jack led Ghost toward Diane's trailer, a spacious, well-maintained rig that spoke of quality care. Ghost followed willingly, trusting Jack even in this uncertain moment. At the ramp, Jack hesitated, the finality of the moment weighing on him. "Mr. Wilson," Diane said, coming to stand beside him, "I'd like to make you a proposition." Jack turned, still keeping one hand on Ghost's neck. "Ma'am?" "Silvercrest needs a new ranch manager, someone who understands horses, particularly Mustangs. The position comes with housing, a 2-bedroom cabin on the property. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable. The previous manager retired last month, and I've been searching for the right replacement." Jack stared at her, not quite comprehending. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a future, Mr. Wilson, one that doesn't separate you from this horse." Her eyes were kind but shrewd. "I didn't just buy a horse today. I invested in a partnership, yours and Ghost's. I'd be a fool to break that up." "I don't understand," Jack said, struggling to process her words. "You paid $6,000 just to offer me a job?" Diane smiled. "I paid $6,000 for an exceptional Kiger Mustang that will eventually contribute to our breeding program, but I'm smart enough to know that the horse comes with a handler who understands him better than anyone else could. It's good business, Mr. Wilson." Jack looked from Diane to Ghost and back again, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Diane's expression softened slightly. "My late husband was a Vietnam veteran. He came home broken in ways that weren't visible to most people. It was horses that saved him, gave him purpose again." She glanced at Ghost. "I recognize the bond you have with this animal. It's the same one Robert had with his old gelding. Some things are worth preserving. Hope, an emotion Jack had almost forgotten, began to stir in his chest. What exactly would this job entail? Overseeing our breeding operation, training young stock, and specifically developing our Mustang program. I've acquired several BLM horses over the past year, but we've had limited success gentling them. Your experience would be invaluable. She named a salary that was modest but fair, with the housing as an additional benefit. Jack took a deep breath, looking at Ghost, who stood patiently waiting, as if he already knew what the decision would be. When would you need an answer? Now would be good, Diane replied with a small smile. That trailer is headed to Silvercrest today, with or without you in the truck behind it. Jack thought about his options, which were in reality few. A motel room until the money ran out. Maybe a small apartment somewhere, scraping by on his pension. Or a fresh start with Ghost still in his life, doing work he understood with animals he loved. I accept, Jack said, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. Thank you, Ms. Mercer. Diane, please. She extended her hand again, this time to seal their agreement. Welcome to Silvercrest, Jack. I think this arrangement will work out well for all of us. Especially this one. She nodded toward Ghost, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. Jack followed Diane's trailer in his old pickup truck, a hastily packed duffel bag tossed in the passenger seat, containing what little he had been able to gather from the ranch before leaving. The bank would clear out the rest. Most of what he truly valued was either in the truck with him or in the trailer ahead, trotting on 4 legs. The 40-mile drive to Silvercrest Ranch took them through rolling hills that gradually gave way to more fertile land. As they crested a final ridge, the ranch spread out before them, a sprawling property nestled in a verdant valley with white fenced paddocks, several barns, and a large main house sitting on a gentle rise overlooking the operation. Someplace, Jack muttered to himself as they passed under an ornate metal arch bearing the Silvercrest name and logo. They followed a winding gravel drive past manicured pastures where horses grazed in small groups. Jack noted the quality of the stock. Well-muscled quarter horses, elegant thoroughbreds, and a few that appeared to be Mustangs, though not with Ghost's distinctive Kiger markings. Diane directed them to a large barn with attached paddocks, where several ranch hands were already waiting. Jack parked his truck and stepped out, watching as they prepared to unload Ghost. James will show you where to settle Ghost, Diane said, approaching Jack. Once you're comfortable with the arrangements, he can take you to your cabin to get situated. I imagine you'll want to stay close to your horse for now. Jack nodded, grateful for her understanding. Thank you, ma'am. Diane. We'll talk details tomorrow, she added. Take today to get familiar with the place. Dinner's at the main house at 7 if you feel up to it, or James can have something sent to your cabin if you prefer. James, the ranch manager who had been at the auction, proved to be a taciturn but efficient man in his 40s. He helped Jack unload Ghost into a spacious stall bedded with fresh straw, then showed him where feed and equipment were kept. Mrs. Mercer said to give you this paddock for your Mustang, James said, indicating a generous enclosure attached to the barn. Says he should have room to move, being wild-born and all. Appreciate it, Jack said, already removing Ghost's halter now that they were safely enclosed. The Mustang shook his head, then nudged Jack's shoulder as if to say, "What is this place?" "It's home now, boy," Jack told him softly. "For both of us, I guess." After making sure Ghost had water and hay, Jack followed James to what would be his new residence. The cabin was more substantial than Jack had expected, a well-maintained house with a covered porch situated about a quarter-mile from the main residence. Inside, he found simple but comfortable furnishings, a kitchen stocked with basic supplies, and windows that offered views of the mountains to the west. Mrs. Mercer had it cleaned up when the last manager left, James explained. Electricity, running water, heat, all working. Phone in the kitchen connects to the main house and barn. Jack set his duffel bag on the bed, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the rapid change in his circumstances. Just that morning, he'd awakened on his ranch for the last time, prepared to lose everything. Now he had a job, a place to live, and most importantly, Ghost was still in his life. "Been with Mrs. Mercer long?" Jack asked, trying to get a sense of what he was walking into. 12 years, James replied. "Started as a hand, worked up to foreman. She's fair. Expects hard work, but rewards it. Knows her horses better than most folks who've been breeding them their whole lives." Jack nodded. That aligned with his first impression of Diane Mercer, shrewd, direct, but with an unexpected compassion. "Ranch hands eat at the bunkhouse," James continued. "You're welcome to join, or Mrs. Mercer often invites the manager to dine at the main house. Your choice most days." After James left, Jack took a quick shower, changing into the cleanest clothes he had from his duffel. Then, unable to stay away, he headed back to the barn. Ghost had already made himself at home, grazing contentedly in the paddock. He lifted his head as Jack approached, trotting over to the fence. "Settling in okay?" Jack asked, stroking the Mustang's face. Ghost snorted softly, pushing against Jack's hand. "Yeah, me too." "Strange day, huh?" For the next few hours, Jack explored the immediate vicinity of the barn, getting a feel for the operation. Silvercrest was impressive, clearly well-funded but also well-run. The horses he observed were in peak condition, the facility spotless and modern. Several ranch hands nodded greeting as they went about their work, eyeing him with curiosity but giving him space. As evening approached, Jack debated whether to accept Diane's dinner invitation. Part of him wanted to retreat to the solitude of the cabin, to process the whirlwind events of the day. But he also recognized the opportunity to learn more about what would be expected of him in his new role. With a final check on Ghost, who seemed perfectly content in his new accommodations, Jack made his way to the main house. The building was impressive, but not ostentatious. A large two-story structure with a wide veranda and simple, elegant landscaping. Jack hesitated at the front door, suddenly aware of his worn jeans and faded button-down shirt. Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal Diane, changed from her auction attire into more casual clothes, though still impeccably put together. "Right on time," she said with approval. "Come in, Jack." The interior of the house was warm and inviting, decorated with a tasteful blend of Western art and more traditional pieces. Diane led him to a dining room where the table was set for two. "I hope you don't mind it just being us," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I thought it would give us a chance to discuss your role here without too many ears listening." Over a meal that was simple but delicious, pot roast with vegetables from the ranch's garden, Diane outlined her vision for Silvercrest's Mustang program. "The wild herds are increasingly pressured," she explained. "Development, drought, competing land use, their numbers are managed through roundups, but what happens to those horses afterward isn't always ideal." Jack nodded, thinking of the holding pens where he'd first seen Ghost. "Most never get adopted, end up warehoused by the BLM for years." "Exactly. What I want to create here is twofold. First, a programmed to gentle picture of a white Mustang with a sign that says, 'For sale $2,' and train BLM Mustangs to increase their adoptability. And second, a small conservation breeding program to preserve the bloodlines, particularly the Spanish-descended Kygers like Ghost." Jack found himself increasingly interested as Diane laid out her plans. It was ambitious but thoughtful, addressing a need he'd seen firsthand. "Why me?" he asked finally. "You must know plenty of experienced horsemen." Diane set down her fork, regarding him steadily. "Because you understand these horses in a way most trainers don't. I watched you with Ghost today. There's a communication there that can't be taught." That sort of connection is rare, Jack, and valuable. As the evening wound down, Jack found himself actually looking forward to the work ahead. For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, he felt a sense of purpose returning. Walking back to his cabin under a sky brilliant with stars, Jack detoured to check on Ghost one last time. The Mustang was dozing in his paddock, one rear hoof cocked in relaxation. At Jack's approach, he lifted his head, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "We landed on our feet, didn't we, boy?" Jack murmured, leaning on the fence. "Or our hooves, in your case." Ghost nickered softly in response, moving to stand beside Jack at the fence, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar place. Together, they gazed out at their new home, the future suddenly looking brighter than it had in a very long time. The first week at Silvercrest passed in a blur of activity as Jack familiarized himself with the operation. Each morning began before dawn, checking on Ghost before meeting with James and the other ranch hands to coordinate the day's work. Diane had given Jack time to learn the systems before taking full control, allowing him to shadow James and get to know the various aspects of the ranch. What had initially seemed overwhelming soon revealed itself as a well-oiled machine. The breeding program was meticulously documented, the training schedules for the young stock carefully planned, the care of each animal overseen with attention to detail. Jack found himself impressed with the operation Diane had built, recognizing the intelligence behind its design. On his 7th morning, Jack rose early and headed to the kitchen for coffee. Through the window, he spotted Ghost in his paddock, head raised toward the eastern hills, where the sun was just beginning to break over the horizon. The sight of the Mustang, silver white in the dawn light, still brought a sense of gratitude washing over Jack. A week ago, he'd been preparing to lose everything. Now, against all odds, he'd been granted a new beginning. After checking on Ghost, Jack made his way to the smaller of the two main barns where Diane had told him the Mustangs were kept. He'd been curious about this part of the operation, but had focused his first week on understanding the core breeding program. Now, with a basic grasp of the ranch's functions, he felt ready to explore what would become his primary responsibility. The barn housed 8 Mustangs in spacious stalls with attached runs, allowing them more freedom than the regular stock. Jack walked slowly past each enclosure, studying the horses. They were a mixed bunch, a few bays, a dun, several with the distinctive dorsal stripes and leg barring of primitive markings, and one with the mealy muzzle characteristic of Spanish bloodlines. All appeared healthy but wary, watching Jack with the suspicious eyes of horses not fully accustomed to human presence. "They're a challenge," came Diane's voice from behind him. She stood in the barn doorway, a mug of coffee in her hands. "That's why I need someone like you." Jack nodded, understanding immediately the difference between these horses and the ranch-raised stock in the main barn. "How long have you had them?" "Between 3 and 8 months. James and our trainer Miguel have made some progress, but it's slow going. They're using traditional methods, and these horses—" She trailed off, gesturing to a particularly wary buckskin who had retreated to the far corner of his run. "They don't respond the same," Jack finished for her. "Wild horses don't think like domestic stock. They've had to make decisions for themselves their whole lives. You can't just expect them to hand that over because you've put them in a pen." Diane smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I've been trying to explain to my staff. You understand it instinctively." Over breakfast in the ranch's kitchen, Diane outlined her goals for the Mustang program in greater detail. The immediate objective was to gentle and train the current group enough to make them adoptable to good homes. The longer-term vision involved establishing a breeding program with select individuals to preserve the traits and bloodlines that were becoming increasingly rare in the wild herds. "I'd like Ghost to be the foundation, sire," she explained, "once we identify the right mares. His Kiger lineage is exceptional, You can see the Spanish influence clearly, but I'll leave the training program entirely in your hands. You know these horses better than anyone else here." Jack felt a weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it was a welcome burden. This was work he understood, work that mattered. "I'll need to bring Ghost to this barn," he said. The others will gain confidence from seeing a Mustang who's comfortable with humans." Diane agreed, and by mid-morning, Ghost had been relocated to the largest stall in the Mustang barn. The other horses watched with interest as Ghost calmly followed Jack into his new space, accepting the change with the trust they'd built together. Over the next few days, Jack began establishing a routine with the Mustangs. Unlike traditional training methods that often focused on control and submission, Jack's approach centered on patience and choice. He spent hours simply sitting near the enclosures, allowing the horses to observe him without pressure. He read aloud from old Western paperbacks he'd found in his cabin, letting them grow accustomed to his voice. The ranch hands watched with barely concealed skepticism. Miguel, the assistant trainer, was particularly dubious. "With respect, Mr. Wilson," he said on the third day, "I don't see how sitting around reading novels is going to gentle these horses. We've tried conventional methods for months." "That's the point," Jack replied mildly. "They're expecting conventional methods now. They're braced against them. We need to show them something different." By the end of his second week, Jack's unorthodox methods had produced their first breakthrough. The dun mare, who had previously retreated whenever anyone approached her enclosure, began standing her ground when Jack appeared. By the third week, she would walk to the fence when he sat nearby, though she still kept a cautious distance. One evening, as Jack was finishing up for the day, Diane joined him outside the Mustang barn. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "The staff is talking about you," Diane said finally, her tone neutral. Jack glanced at her. "Good or bad?" "Confused, mostly. Your methods aren't what they're used to." She turned to face him directly. "But I've noticed the changes in the horses. The dun mare especially. She's different already." Jack nodded, pleased she had observed the subtle shift. "Trust takes time. Can't rush it or force it, especially with these horses." "Some of the hands think I made a mistake bringing you on," Diane continued. "James has expressed concerns that your approach is too slow, too soft." A small smile touched her lips. "I told them I'll judge by results, not methods." "Appreciate the faith," Jack said, suddenly aware of the pressure to prove himself. "I know it seems strange, but I've seen it work before. With Ghost, with other rescues. These horses need to choose to trust us. We can't demand it." Diane studied him thoughtfully. "You military men surprise me sometimes. Everyone expects the drill sergeant approach, but you've got more patience than most of my staff who've never seen combat." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "War teaches you a lot about trust. Who deserves it? How easily it's broken? How hard it is to rebuild? Guess I see something similar in these Mustangs. They've had their world turned upside down, everything familiar stripped away. They're just trying to make sense of it all, figure out who they can count on." Something in Diane's expression softened. "You're good for this place, Jack Wilson, for these horses, and maybe for more than just them." Before Jack could respond to the unexpected comment, she nodded toward the barn. "I have some potential buyers visiting next week. They're interested in our regular stock, but I'd like to show them what we're doing with the Mustangs too. Think you'll have something to demonstrate by then." It was a challenge, but also a show of confidence. Jack looked toward the barn where Ghost stood watching them through the open top of his stall door. The Mustang's calm presence had already begun influencing the others, just as Jack had hoped. "We'll be ready," he said. making a silent promise to both Diane and the horses in his care. "They'll see something worth noticing, I guarantee it." The days leading up to the buyer's visit were filled with intense preparation across Silvercrest. Ranch hands groomed horses until their coats gleamed, paddocks were freshly raked, and fences received touch-up paint. Jack observed the flurry of activity with interest, recognizing that Diane ran her operation with military precision when it came to appearances. For his part, Jack focused on the Mustangs, particularly the dun mare who had shown the most progress. He'd named her Sage for her golden coat that matched the drought-resistant plants dotting the surrounding hills. Unlike the other staff who cycled through their duties, Jack spent every available moment with the Mustangs, his patience unwavering as he gradually earned their trust. 3 days before the buyer's arrival, Jack made his first significant breakthrough with Sage. He had been sitting on an overturned bucket outside her run, reading aloud as usual, when he glanced up to find her standing directly in front of him, barely 3 feet away. Moving with deliberate slowness, Jack extended his hand, palm up, offering but not demanding. After several minutes of consideration that seemed to stretch into eternity, Sage lowered her muzzle and briefly touched his fingertips before retreating. It was a small gesture by conventional standards, but Jack understood its magnitude. The first voluntary contact, a moment of trust freely given rather than coerced. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same he'd experienced when Ghost had first approached him years ago. "Good girl," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "See, nothing to fear." By the following day, Sage was consistently approaching when Jack sat near her enclosure. He began bringing apple slices, offering them flat on his palm, which she would delicately take before stepping back. Each interaction built upon the previous one, creating a foundation of trust Jack knew was essential before any actual training could begin. The day before the buyer's visit, Miguel stopped by the Mustang barn to check on Jack's progress. His skepticism had not diminished over the weeks, though he had been professional enough to keep his doubts mostly to himself. "Mrs. Mercer says you'll be showing the Mustangs tomorrow," he said, leaning against the barn door. "What exactly are you planning to demonstrate? They're still basically untouched." Jack continued brushing Ghost, who stood relaxed under his ministrations. "Not planning a rodeo show, if that's what you're wondering. Just going to show them what's possible with patience." Miguel shook his head. "These people are looking for performance horses. They won't be impressed by a wild horse that can take a carrot from your hand." Jack set down the brush, turning to face the younger man directly. "You ever serve, Miguel?" The question caught the trainer off guard. "Military? No, sir. My unit in Afghanistan had this interpreter. Local guy, smart as a whip but scared to death when we first got him. Wouldn't go near certain areas, wouldn't talk to certain elders. Command wanted to replace him, said he wasn't effective enough." Jack's eyes grew distant, remembering. "I argued to keep him, spent time with him. Figured out he had his reasons for being cautious. 6 months later, he saved our entire unit by recognizing a trap before we walked into it." Miguel frowned, confused by the apparent non-sequitur. "What's that got to do with horse training?" "Everything," Jack replied. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from those who've had to survive differently than we have. These Mustangs know things our domestic horses have forgotten, but we have to earn the right to learn from them." The day of the visit dawned clear and cool. Jack was up before sunrise, ensuring the Mustang barn was immaculate and each horse had been groomed. Ghost, central to Jack's demonstration plans, received extra attention, his white coat gleaming like fresh snow in the morning light. Diane had been deliberately vague about the potential buyers, mentioning only that they were important to the ranch's future. Around mid-morning, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up the main drive, followed by a truck hauling an expensive horse trailer. Jack, watching from the Mustang barn, straightened his shirt, the best he owned, though still modest compared to the polished appearance of Silvercrest's other staff. James came to fetch him a few minutes later. "Mrs. Mercer would like you to join the tour when they reach the training arena," he said formally. "They're starting at the main barn with the established bloodlines." Jack nodded, appreciating the extra time to prepare. He led Ghost from his stall and into the small paddock attached to the Mustang barn, then brought Sage into an adjacent enclosure. The dun mare was still wary, but had grown accustomed enough to Jack that she remained calm in his presence, even in the new surroundings. An hour later, Jack spotted the group approaching, Diane in the lead, followed by a middle-aged couple dressed in expensive Western wear, two younger men in business attire, and James and Miguel bringing up the rear. Jack stood waiting beside Ghost's paddock, one hand resting lightly on the Mustang's neck. "And this is Jack Wilson, our new Mustang program manager," Diane introduced as they approached. "Jack, this is Thomas and Elizabeth Montgomery. They own Montgomery Equestrian Center in Kentucky, and these gentlemen are their associates, Mr. Chen and Mr. Rivera." Jack shook hands with each visitor, noting the appraising look in Thomas Montgomery's eyes. "Mrs. Mercer tells us you have a unique approach to Mustang training," Montgomery said, his tone politely skeptical. "I understand you were a military man." "Yes, sir. 30 years. Retired as Command Sergeant Major." Montgomery nodded with newfound respect. "Served myself, though not career. Marine Corps, 2 tours in Iraq." The shared background created an immediate connection, as it often did among veterans. Jack relaxed slightly, recognizing an opportunity to bridge the gap between his methods and the visitor's expectations. "Mrs. Mercer mentioned you might demonstrate what you've been working on," Elizabeth Montgomery said, glancing at the 2 Mustangs in their separate paddocks, "though I understand it's early in the process." Jack nodded. "What I'd like to show you isn't a finished product, ma'am. It's a foundation. Most traditional training begins with control, halters, leads, round penning. My approach starts earlier, with choice and trust." With that introduction, Jack opened the gate to Ghost's paddock and entered without halter or lead rope. The white Mustang stood calmly as Jack approached, then followed him without hesitation as he walked across the enclosure. At Jack's subtle hand signals, Ghost stopped, turned, and even backed up, all without physical contact or restraint. "This is Ghost," Jack explained. "He came to me 3 years ago from the same BLM holding pens as these newer Mustangs, no different from them at the start, scared, defensive, untrusting." The demonstration continued for several minutes, Ghost responding to Jack's quiet commands with a willingness that spoke of their deep connection. The Montgomerys watched intently, their initial skepticism giving way to genuine interest. "And this," Jack said finally, moving toward Sage's paddock, "is where we begin. This mare has been here about 6 months, but we've only been working with my method for 3 weeks." Jack approached Sage's paddock slowly, conscious of the audience but keeping his focus on the mare. The dun stood alert, ears pricked forward, watching Jack with cautious interest. The Montgomerys and their associates moved closer to observe, while Diane hung back slightly, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Sage came in from the same BLM roundup as several of our other Mustangs," Jack explained, keeping his voice low and even. "Traditional methods weren't making much headway after months of trying. We've been working with my approach for just under 3 weeks." Thomas Montgomery raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is your approach, Mr. Wilson?" "Respect," Jack said simply, understanding that for a wild horse, trust is earned, not taken. He stood at the gate without opening it, allowing Sage to make the first move. For several long moments, nothing happened. The mare remained at the far end of the paddock, watching intently. Jack could sense the visitors growing restless, could almost hear what they were thinking, that this was no demonstration at all, just a man standing at a fence while a wild horse ignored him. Miguel shifted uncomfortably, and even James's normally impassive face showed concern. Then, almost imperceptibly, Sage took a step forward, then another. Her movements were hesitant but deliberate as she crossed the paddock toward Jack. The assembled group grew still, sensing the significance of what they were witnessing. When Sage reached the fence, she stopped a few feet away, nostrils flaring as she took in Jack's scent and that of the strangers. Jack remained motionless, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed but attentive. Then, with infinite slowness, he raised his hand, palm up, extending it toward the space between them without crossing into her comfort zone. For what seemed like an eternity, Sage considered the offered hand. Then, with a delicacy that belied her wild origins, she stretched her neck forward and touched her muzzle to Jack's fingertips, holding the contact for several seconds before stepping back. "My God," Elizabeth Montgomery whispered, understanding the significance of the moment. Her husband nodded slowly, professional interest evident in his gaze. "This is where we begin," Jack said, lowering his hand. Not with demands, but with conversation. She chose to make contact. Every step forward from here builds on that choice. Jack reached into his pocket and produced a small apple slice. Holding it on his flattened palm, he offered it to Sage. She approached again, more confidently this time, taking the treat before backing up a few steps to eat it. In traditional training, we might have roped her, forced a halter on, round-penned her until she gave in, Jack continued, producing another slice of apple. That creates compliance through exhaustion or fear. I'm looking for partnership based on mutual respect. Thomas Montgomery stepped closer to the fence, his initial skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. "And this translates to practical riding and handling eventually." "It does," Jack confirmed, "but the foundation is stronger. These horses don't submit because they're broken. They cooperate because they trust. Ghost is proof of that." As if on cue, Ghost approached the adjoining fence, standing regally as all eyes turned to him. The contrast between the still cautious Sage and the confident, relaxed Ghost provided a powerful visual of the journey's start and destination. "How long from where she is now to where he is?" Mr. Chen asked, speaking for the first time. "Depends on the horse," Jack replied honestly. "Each has their own timeline. Rushing creates setbacks, but once the foundation is solid, the rest comes surprisingly quickly. They're intelligent animals. Once they understand we're not a threat, they're eager to learn." For the next 20 minutes, Jack demonstrated incremental steps in his training method, using Ghost to show the progression. The white Mustang worked at liberty, responding to subtle cues, demonstrating a connection with Jack that went beyond standard training. When Jack finally brought out a saddle, Ghost stood calmly for tacking up without restraint, then moved fluidly under Jack's weight, their movements so harmonious they seemed like a single being. "The traditional methods work," Jack acknowledged as he dismounted. "They've been used for centuries, but they were developed when horses were tools, not partners. What I'm trying to show is that there's another way, slower at the start perhaps, but ultimately creating something special." As the demonstration concluded, Thomas Montgomery approached Jack directly. "Impressive work, Sergeant Major. Not the conventional approach, certainly, but I can't argue with the results." He gestured toward Ghost. "That horse moves with you like he can read your mind." "Just lots of time and patience, sir," Jack replied. "Montgomery Equestrian specializes in youth programs," Thomas continued. "We've been considering adding a Mustang component, conservation education combined with riding instruction. Our challenge has been finding horses suitable for inexperienced riders." Jack nodded, understanding the concern. "Wild horses aren't for beginners, that's true. But a Mustang that chooses the relationship rather than submitting to it? That's a horse you can trust with anyone." Elizabeth joined her husband. "We have a daughter," she said, her eyes still on Ghost. 16, recovering from a riding accident last year, lost her confidence completely. We've tried everything to get her back in the saddle, but she's terrified now. Her voice softened. Watching your connection with that horse. It's different from anything we've seen. Jack felt a familiar tug in his chest, the recognition of trauma, of fear that runs bone deep. Fear recognizes fear, he said quietly. And trust recognizes trust. Sometimes what we need isn't someone who pushes us past our boundaries, but someone who respects them until we're ready to redraw them ourselves. The Montgomerys exchanged a glance that conveyed an entire conversation in a moment. We'd like to continue this discussion, Thomas said finally. Not just about purchasing horses, but potentially about expanding our collaboration. Your approach might be exactly what our program needs. After the visitors departed with Diane for lunch at the main house, Miguel approached Jack as he was returning Ghost to his stall. The younger trainer's expression had shifted from skepticism to something more complex. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps respect. That was not what I expected, Miguel admitted. The mare has never approached anyone like that before. She just needed time, Jack said, removing Ghost's saddle, and a reason to trust. Mrs. Mercer seems pleased, Miguel observed. The Montgomerys are major clients, if they partner with Silvercrest on a program. He left the implication hanging. Jack nodded, understanding the significance. This wasn't just about proving his methods worked. It was about the ranch's future, about Diane's investment in him paying off. Later that afternoon, Diane found Jack back at the Mustang barn, checking on Sage and the others after the excitement of the day. The Montgomerys were impressed, she said without preamble. They've invited us to visit their facility in Kentucky next month. They want to discuss a formal partnership, their resources, our Mustangs, and your training methods. Jack paused, absorbing the news. That's good for Silvercrest. It's good for all of us, Diane corrected, including you. They specifically mentioned wanting you involved in developing the program. She studied him for a moment. You proved something important today, Jack. Not just to them, but to my staff. To me. Jack felt a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged begin to lift from his shoulders. He'd come to Silvercrest with nothing but a duffel bag and a horse, unsure if Diane's offer had been charity or truly a fresh start. Now, for the first time, he felt the ground solidifying beneath his feet, a new purpose taking root. Ghost nickered softly from his stall, as if sensing Jack's thoughts. Some things, it seemed, were meant to be, even when they began with a foreclosure notice and a desperate auction. 1 year later, Jack stood in the center of Silvercrest's newly constructed round pen, watching as a dozen visitors observed his demonstration from the viewing stands. The Mustang program had grown beyond what any of them had anticipated, evolving from a small conservation effort into a nationally recognized training initiative that drew visitors from across the country. The partnership with Montgomery Equestrian had been formalized 6 months earlier, creating a dual-location program that combined Silvercrest's Mustang expertise with the Montgomerys' extensive facilities and youth outreach. Twice monthly, Jack traveled to Kentucky to oversee training and development there, bringing his methods to a wider audience of both horses and humans. The key is to create a space where choice is possible, Jack explained to the current group, a mix of potential adopters, BLM officials, and horse trainers curious about his approach. Traditional methods often eliminate choice to create compliance. We're looking for something different. Partnership based on mutual trust. As if on cue, Sage trotted up to Jack, her once cautious demeanor replaced by confident curiosity. The dun mare had become his most persuasive success story after Ghost, a formerly defensive, shut-down Mustang transformed into an engaged, willing partner. She stopped beside him, and Jack rested his hand lightly on her neck, the contact natural and easy between them. From the edge of the round pen, Ghost watched the proceedings with interest. The white Mustang remained Jack's personal horse, though he now served as both demonstration partner and breeding stallion for the program. His first foals would arrive in the spring, carefully bred to select mares to preserve the bloodlines that were becoming increasingly rare in the wild herds. After the demonstration concluded, and the visitors dispersed for a tour of the facilities, Diane approached Jack, her usual composed expression softened by what might have been pride. "The BLM representatives seemed impressed," she noted. "If they approve our proposal, we could double the number of Mustangs in the program next year." Jack nodded, rubbing Sage's forehead as she nudged against his shoulder. "They've been looking for alternatives to the holding pens. Our adoption success rate gives them a solution they can support." In the past year, all 8 of the original Mustangs had completed training and found homes through their selective adoption program. Even more significantly, 4 had gone to families with special needs children or trauma survivors, their gentle responsiveness making them ideal therapy partners. "The Montgomerys called this morning," Diane continued. "Elizabeth says Lucy is competing again next month, first time since her accident." Jack couldn't help but smile at that news. Lucy Montgomery, the teenager who had lost her confidence after a riding accident, had been one of their greatest successes. During the Montgomerys' first visit to Silvercrest, the girl had been nearly mute with anxiety. 6 months later, after working with a patient chestnut Mustang named Copper, she had rediscovered her love of horses through a relationship built on mutual trust rather than dominance. "That's good to hear," Jack said simply, though the words hardly captured the satisfaction he felt. As they walked back toward the barns, Diane gave Jack a sidelong glance. "You know, when I bid on Ghost at that auction, I never imagined where it would lead. Thought I was just giving a good horse a home and maybe helping a veteran down on his luck." Jack chuckled. "Makes 2 of us. When I put that $1 starting bid on him, I was just trying to find him a decent home before I lost everything." The irony wasn't lost on either of them, how that desperate moment had transformed into something neither could have predicted. The ranch had gained not just a valuable program, but a sense of purpose that resonated with everyone involved. Even Miguel, once skeptical of Jack's methods, had become an enthusiastic convert after seeing the results firsthand. Later that evening, after completing his chores, Jack saddled Ghost for their nightly ride. It had become a ritual, a quiet exploration of the furthest reaches of Silvercrest's property as the day's heat dissipated and the land took on the golden glow of sunset. These rides were Jack's meditation, his time to process the day's events and center himself again. They followed a familiar trail that wound up into the foothills overlooking the ranch. Ghost moved with effortless grace beneath him, the Mustang's sure-footedness on the rocky terrain a reminder of his wild heritage. At their usual stopping point, a flat outcropping with a panoramic view of the valley below, Jack dismounted and let Ghost graze while he sat on a sun-warmed boulder. From this vantage, he could see Silvercrest spread out below, the white fences, the barns, the training areas, and the main house glowing warmly in the evening light. Beyond it, the landscape stretched toward the horizon, a mix of working ranches, small communities, and the distant mountains from which Ghost had originally come. A year ago, he'd awakened to what he thought was the end of everything. Now, looking over what had become his home, Jack felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for much of his life. The military had given him purpose, but it had also taken its toll. Now, in this unexpected second chapter, he'd found not just work, but healing, for himself, for Ghost, and for the many Mustangs that had passed through their program. Ghost wandered over, nudging Jack's shoulder in their familiar gesture of connection. Jack stroked the horse's gleaming white neck, still amazed sometimes at the journey that had brought them here. "We did all right, didn't we, boy?" he murmured. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jack and Ghost made their way back down to the ranch. The lights of the cabin Jack now called home glowed welcomingly in the gathering dusk. Next week would bring new visitors, new Mustangs from the BLM holdings, new challenges to face. The program was growing, evolving with each success, each lesson learned, but the core of it remained unchanged. The belief that patience, respect, and trust could bridge even the widest divides. At the small paddock beside his cabin, Jack unsaddled Ghost and turned him loose for the night. The Mustang shook himself, then moved to the fence where Jack stood, pressing his forehead against the man's chest in a moment of quiet connection. A dollar horse. That's what they'd called Ghost when Jack had made the desperate decision to put him up for auction. But some things, Jack had learned, couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Some things were beyond price, like trust freely given, like second chances, like finding your way home when you thought all was lost. Ghost nickered softly in the growing darkness, and Jack smiled, reaching out to stroke the white face that had become the symbol of everything he'd gained when he thought he was losing it all.